Hello, everyone, and welcome to Real Talk Food Safety.
Hello, welcome, welcome. We're excited to be here today.
We are excited to be here. It's funny when Tia, right when we're putting together what our shows are going to be, we've had this one on our list for a while, and it's been kind of fun because knowing that this is another hot topic in our community. So we're excited to talk about compliance, the dirty word.
Yes, we are. We are super excited about talking about compliance. It's something that's been out there that we've had conversations um, with people out in the industry, and it's one of those words that we cringe when we hear people say, "Are we compliant? We just want to be compliant." We cringe as a food safety and quality group.
We do because we know that there's different levels, and when we hear compliance, that's like, wow, that's just meeting, or it seems like it. And
Yes.
we are curious, and the more Tia and I talk about it, does it apply in all areas? And where is it sometimes helpful to be in compliance versus maybe you want to be more than compliant?
Right.
And so that's what we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. So,
Yes.
as you listen to us, we really want to know where you're listening from. So, please add in the comments where you're joining us from. If you're listening live, use hashtag live. If you're listening at the replay, please use hashtag replay because we do go back and look at the comments and message with you all. With the conversation that we have. So we would love to hear if you're listening, where you're from, and if you're listening on replay or live.
Yeah, and you know what would be fun? Like throw an emoji in there on when you hear compliance, what you think of.
Yeah.
I would love to see the different responses that people have and kind of what bubbles up for them when we start talking about compliance.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Because we know that we have similar thoughts around compliance, right? But we've all lived different lives around it. We've all had our run-ins, right, with compliance and talking with other people that might be outside of food safety and quality. So we definitely want to hear your perspective on this topic.
We do. And we know even within our community that, right, this is something that comes up periodically. And, Felix has been a really great champion of talking about compliance. And so we love bringing in those other perspectives because, right, when we have these conversations, doesn't this set us up to, have more power? And I don't mean power like over, but power to understand and make decisions and come from that place where we really can
Absolutely.
stand in that um, in that space to make those informed decisions.
Absolutely. I feel like every time we have this live, there's something new that I learn, either from you, Jill, just talking and hearing your perspective, or from the audience reading through the comments and hearing people's perspectives. There's always something that's like, oh man, I could have handled that a little differently. Or I'm going to do that the next time I'm in this situation. Or, we have a client that's dealing with this issue.
Mhm.
This is how I would advise them moving forward or help them put this process into place because of something that someone mentioned in the chat. So I always learn from these lives.
Absolutely. And as we're even talking, I'm kind of watching a few of the comments come in. Nikita, thanks for the emoji. I kind of like that one. But welcome, Michelle and Lonray, Austin. It's always good to have you here. And Nikita,
Yes.
Missy, great to see you. Elise and Robert, great to have you with us as well.
Yes. People all over the US. So I know the weather it's changing wherever you are. I think we were supposed to get some snow flurries here in Baltimore. So
We had
um,
this morning that was
oh,
here.
did you? Okay. Well, of course, outside of Minneapolis, what are
Mhm.
we to expect there?
I know.
But we are all ready for spring. So hopefully, where you are and you're listening from, you're starting to get those little pieces of spring.
Exactly. We're hoping we keep seeing the signs. We know it's coming. So
Yes,
we're excited
absolutely,
about that.
absolutely.
Yes. And if it's your first time joining us, welcome. We're really honored to have you with us today. And we're Jill and Tia. We like to say we're your go-to team for food safety and quality, leadership and culture. And really, we look at how do we help support you building sustainable food safety cultures, not just programs, and recognizing that as individuals, we all have a part in being able to move the needle where we want it to go. And so we really believe that it starts with each of us as individuals and that we can have an impact and make a difference when it comes to our teams, to our development, and to the culture that we want to see.
So let's jump into the topic.
Yes.
So we really want to talk about compliance. What does that mean for us as food safety and quality leaders? And how does compliance support or enable or not support, right, food safety and quality culture? There's pieces of it that, again, put in the chat how you feel from an emoji standpoint when you hear the word compliance. But it's because we hear it often. Mm-hmm. So how do we use compliance or help influence our organizations to move past compliance as we work to strengthen our food safety and quality cultures?
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting. Lonray already even shared that we live compliance if we're honest with ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why this always bubbles up, because so often people say, well, are we in compliance? Like, that's the end all to our game. And so this is kind of the challenge. Like, how do we understand where is compliance really the end game? Like, where is it good enough? And where do we still have other risks, whether they are consumer and public health risks or brand risks that we really need to talk about? I don't know about you. I've certainly had this compliance question come up and feel like it kind of like hamstring. I was hamstrung by it, like where people were like, well, if we're in compliance, then we're good enough.
Right.
And how do we help even have some of the tools to be able to talk further on that topic with others who maybe don't understand why compliance as the bar is not the best thing?
Right, exactly. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So during our conversation, we want to hear your thoughts. Please add them to the comments, because we're going to walk through a few different perspectives and talk about our experience, loop in your experience, mm-hmm. And how we can move past it.
Yeah. Okay, Tia. So I was going to start off. So Tia and I have little conversations around this ahead of time, yeah. Right? And one of the things we were talking about is like, why does it keep coming up and being such a hot topic in food safety and quality?
Yeah. And, in my experience, it keeps coming up because to move past compliance, your organization has to put in resources. To even get compliant, they have to put in resources, whether or not that's financial resources, that's people resources, training. You really have to invest in order to move past compliance. So for us as food safety and quality individuals, we're here to protect our consumers. So for us, just being compliant is not enough, because we know that being compliant does not protect us or eliminate all risk. And our job is to make sure that every time a consumer is eating our product, that they're not going to get sick. And we know just through our experience and through data that just being compliant is not enough.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because when we talk about compliance, it's often so yes or no. Right. And one of the things that I find really fascinating is if we would consider this to be a report card. And when we look at a report card, to pass the class, to pass the course, we only need a passing grade, which means a not fail. Right. So if we use like the scale, like over here we have A, B, C, D, and F. Is compliance really at a D? Right. Is that what it takes to be not failing, is really just a D? Like, we're not on the A game, we're on the D game.
Yeah. And that's something to think about, and that's something to think about from an organization standpoint. Do we want to be a D? Do we want to be a C organization? Or do we really want to be an A organization where we're protecting all of our consumers each time they eat our product? Mm-hmm. I want to be clear too, as we talk about compliance. Compliance is the bar of entry. It is required to make food. So everyone making food should be compliant. And that's something that we wholeheartedly support. And we even help our clients get there where they've fell into this product or they want to make this product, they're starting to sell and they need to become compliant. That needs to happen, right? Like you need to pass in order for you to make food. Mm-hmm. But as you're looking to actually build a food safety and quality culture, you really have to think past being a D or a C organization because it's not good enough. It's not good enough to protect all consumers.
No, it's not. And it's interesting when we talk about compliance and where it falls because, I was sharing with Tia, I've often run into people within the organization who would say, well, if we didn't get, and I come from a strong USDA background, like if we didn't get an NR, a non-compliance report, then like everything's good, right? Mm-hmm. And I always find that really fascinating. Like, how do we as food safety quality professionals help others within our organizations or the industry even understand, like, once again, that's all about compliance and that's just the bar. Right. So absolutely. Yeah, like lack of those regulatory type actions doesn't mean always that you're in compliance or in a good spot.
And that's so important to talk to your organization about and continue to keep that front of mind, is that on any given day, like as you're seeing these issues, to say, well, if an auditor was here and saw this issue, then they probably would have given us an NR or a 483 or some type of non-compliance. When we even think about like third-party audits or GFSI audits, we would have gotten some type of non-conformance here. It's just the fact that they did not see it on the audit. Or, we have to remember that an audit is a screenshot of what's happening that day or those days at your facility. So having those things front of mind all the time with your organization to say, this is a risk. This is a risk for us, not just from a compliance standpoint, but also from a brand risk and a consumer risk standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and that's really interesting, right? Because even often as we're doing even our own internal inspections, like if I need to go out and do an operational sanitation inspection, like are people handling things correctly out on the floor today? Usually the bar is it good or is it not good?
Right.
So, right, even as we do our assessment. So as, as champions of these programs, what do you think are some ways that we move past that?
Yeah. Like how do we move past the, yes, this is good, no, this is not, for me,
to help shift people from we're in compliance to some other place.
Right, exactly. I like to connect it with the consumer. One way is to say that this may be incompliant, but if you were a consumer and you got this product, would you be happy with it? If you knew what we know here, would you feel safe eating this product? Do you want to take on that risk for your small children or for your elderly parents or elderly grandparents? And having people connect personally to it to say, okay, this is the risk and your family might be affected by that risk. Mm-hmm. Is that okay? Would you still feel okay making the decision that you're making, regardless of if it falls underneath being compliant or not?
Which is a really good approach because then we're starting to shift away right from just compliance risk to actually moving into the brand and consumer risk, which is where we know that's the shift that we want everyone to come along with us to see. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. One thing too, like as you're working with your organization, it's important to push them towards having their own internal policies, that's greater than compliance. So like, Austin even mentioned compliance is an opportunity to improve. Absolutely. Right. Like compliance is that baseline. And then you look at how do we improve our organization, our food safety and quality organization. And a lot of companies do that through internal policies. So knowing that your policies are steps above compliance will also help you have that conversation internally to say that, well, this is the company policy for us to follow, and this is the reason why that policy is in place, to prevent us from having a recall or prevent us from being like so and so company, even like pointing out things that happen in industry where it's like we don't want to be that person, to have that issue, even though we know the risk is small. Once it happens, the brand reputation could be ruined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And making that shift. And I think that is part of like, how do we challenge ourselves to move to that next place? And one of the things that we had done was, for example, I'll use operational sanitation. Once again, come back to that example, is we started adding like a third option, like needs improvement. And that was really a challenge because we were still in this mindset that if we show that we need improvement and our records are reviewed, doesn't that seem like a fail? And so really helping our team understand that, there's a difference between a total, like here's a fail, like product at risk, like contamination type risk versus, we could actually just handle that better. We could actually do this part better. It's not horrible, but that gets back to that spirit of improvement and incorporating others to help find how do we help move the bar.
Yeah. I love that because I think when people look at it, are we in compliance? Are we not in compliance? They're really not taking into account that needs improvement area. They're just looking for the yes, no. Are we compliant? Are we not? Can we move forward from there? Versus we still have risk. It needs improvement here. This is how we strengthen our programs. And in reality, as we think about food safety culture, the goal is to strengthen your food safety programs in every year. So it's important for you to even look and identify those opportunities for those needs improvements or continuous improvement efforts.
Sorry, I'm chuckling a little bit. Missy, thanks for sharing, right? Sometimes USDA does not like the needs improvement because they don't know what to do with that. And so it's really interesting as we talk about how do we shift the mindset to go from one to, from this yes or no compliance, no compliance, to a space where we can enter into continuous improvement so that we can pull in, because continuous improvement represents that there's additional risk, whether it's consumer, brand, maybe it's financial, whatever those risks are, that we can still move in that space.
Yeah.
And so, how, it's one of those challenges. How do we help encourage that? How do we help people see a new way to do that?
I think even to Missy's point, this is a really good point on why compliance is not enough. Is because we know as a part of our jobs, we are really focused on when we're having those audits with FDA, USDA, we're really focused on how do they want to see the data? How do we show the data? How do we prove that we're being safe, right? So in Missy's case, she's saying like her USDA didn't even like that. So they removed it to make them happy. That's compliance, right? To what her USDA inspector auditor wanted. That does not help improve your food safety culture. That does not help you eliminate any risk. That doesn't even mean that you internally need to say that it needs improvement and we need to work on improvement. So that's where organizations and people in the organizations, I should say, run into issues where it's like, okay, we don't have a needs improvement. We have a yes or no, but we're trying to satisfy the USDA inspector that we have. But we internally should understand that we do need improvement in these areas, and that's how we're going to improve. So I think that's that's what we deal with, right, as food safety and quality leaders.
That's the reality.
Conversations, with auditors, right, and that is the compliance piece, and that's why we know being compliant is not enough for us to improve our food safety cultures.
So kind of along that thought. Okay, so where we've talked about, well, where would places be where compliance is enough? Are
Mm,
there places where compliance actually is enough?
yeah. So when I think about this question on, because we've been talking like broad scale, right? Like,
Mhm.
we have to be compliant, but we need to be more in order to eliminate the risk out there. Um, but at Catalyst, we talk about the journey of food safety
Yeah.
and where organizations are along the journey of food safety to a world class um, food safety culture. And we know that some people are at the point that they need to get compliant and they need to maintain being compliant. And when I think about it, I think about organizations that may be new to food, have a low exposure risk with limited sales. So, they're not touching a broad group of people, or they're not touching billions of people, or even millions of people at this point. So their exposures is pretty low. So they are the right type of organization to ensure that they are compliant and that they can maintain being compliant, because that just helps them along the journey, right? Where once they have maintained being compliant for a period of time, now they're ready for those continuous improvement efforts. I think we've all seen organizations that try to move too quickly. And it's like, look, if we're not even doing GMPs and
Mm.
washing our hands, how are we going to be able to maintain a full, preventive maintenance program? How are we going to be able to maintain a full, program that is, that has maintenance signing off on sanitation, turnover to operations, they're signing off. How are we going to be able to have robust systems in that way if the organization cannot even maintain compliance? So that's where I see where, we start with our clients, even where it's like, let's focus on being compliant and maintaining, and then we'll move you along the journey.
Yeah, that's a good point because at the core of compliance really is about risk as well. It's just sometimes the wording creates some of these loopholes to be interpreted a little bit differently than where we know we want to be,
Right.
right? But even as you point out, right, even GMPs, like if we were in compliance with GMPs, that'd actually probably be pretty good
Right.
if we
Yeah.
could. Or the one that we talked about earlier, like what about labeling? Is labeling an area where if we're in compliance, it is like that is good enough because
Mm-hmm.
it's so prescriptive in how it's done and how it's laid out and how it's communicated versus some of the other areas maybe aren't as prescriptive. Does that
Absolutely.
does that feel right or is that one where maybe it's maybe I'm looking at it wrong?
No, I like that example of labeling in particular because, I feel like that's one of the few areas that we really do live and breathe compliance, where we look at our label. Obviously, marketing wants to add extra things to our labels, but our goal is to make sure with all the marketing information on there that the label is compliant, from a USDA standpoint, from an FDA standpoint, that's important. I think that's a really good example where compliance is enough, where, and that's really where we focus on from a labeling standpoint. Now, I guess some other things that kind of go above and beyond compliance that you might want to add for labeling might be a may contain statement, right?
Mm.
Like a may contain statement is not required by law, but some organizations add them to communicate additional risks to the consumer.
True. Yeah, and it's interesting, Austin. Thanks for the comment about culture, because one of the things that comes up is, when we talk about being compliant, even if that's the culture, is and talking about food safety culture, is compliance really setting food safety culture like we all think about with this dreamy state where we're all on board, we all know what we're doing? Does compliance set us up for failure to get to this place over here?
That's a really good question, and I would love to hear what people think about that in the audience. I don't think compliance sets us up for failure. I think compliance is just that first step.
Mm.
The problem is that as we continue to have conversations about food safety improvements, and how to really build a robust world-class organization around food safety, that organizations don't move past the first step in food safety,
Mm.
um, because of many reasons, right? That we've talked about. So compliance isn't bad. Compliance shouldn't make us cringe all the time, unless our organization should be moving from that first step.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a good point because even when we talk about food safety culture, I often think back to the GFSI white paper that came out on maturity, right?
Hmm.
And I think of compliance down at one end of the spectrum and world class at the other,
Yeah,
where compliance is so part of the discussion. Even it isn't around compliance. I think, Tia, like you said, it's around, as an organization, what are the standards we've set that we know already take into account compliance, but also address the other risks that we want.
right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mhm.
And it's important for you to also look out and say, what are other organizations or people in our industry that they're dealing with that may be compliant, right? Or they have a GFSI certification and they got a 99 on it last year, or just passed it with a 99. Why are they going through a recall? And I think Elise brought this up earlier in her comment, where it's so important that we are learning from those situations and really looking at other companies' recalls that they're going through, or even if you're a part of organizations, food safety organizations, or group discussions, learning from other companies on what issues they're having, which, I mean, we know that they are compliant. They don't have any major 483s out there. We can see whether or not they had any major nonconformances. We can see if they've had any recalls or any alerts. We can look up that information. We don't see any, but we know that they still deal with issues. And so being able to bring that information into your organization and say, hey, we could be this person having a recall, even if we are compliant, and don't see major issues on our regulatory audits or even on our third party audits.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's a good point because one of the questions, that came through, Michelle, thank you, right? Like when leadership perhaps sees that compliance is enough, how do we help with that? Um, how do we help move that perspective and understanding something different? And I guess I would go back to some of the things like the needs improvement column,
Mm-hmm.
because how do we collect information on our own internal risks that we see on a more regular basis to communicate? How do we show where compliance maybe got us this far, but we still have these things that really are a step away from an issue?
Right.
Um, or is it something as basic as, like, I mean, maybe this sounds a little crazy, but like we've all walked into a production facility where you're like, this doesn't look as clean as I would want it to be, right? Like,
Right.
would I be willing to put my lunch down here and pick it up and eat it again? Um, what are some of the things that we can really okay, we've all seen that equipment where you're like, not gonna happen.
Right. Exactly.
But how do we help communicate some of those very practical things to leadership?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and well, this is, I think I've shared this story before, but I did work at a location where it was just driven by a compliance. Like, do
Mm-hmm.
we meet or do we not meet? And it had some tolerance for a pathogen. Well, not a pathogen. It had tolerance. It had micro tolerance. And so one of the things that we helped demonstrate was, instead of reporting as to show compliance, we looked at how do we report to show a consumer experience. And so
Mm-hmm.
we shifted some of our metrics to better align, to hopefully give our leadership and our team and all of us really a new perspective to understand how that really plays out for a consumer.
Right.
And that was really powerful. It took a lot of work, don't get me wrong. And it took a lot of people going, well, why would you do that? But once we looked at it from a different way, right, it opened a new channel to have communication and discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean that like the money came rolling in and that our leadership was like, wow, this is the best thing ever. Thank you for opening our eyes.
Right.
But it changed our conversations.
Yeah.
And as food safety and quality professionals, if how do we help change the conversation away from compliance?
Right. Yeah.
So how can you look at what other things could we want to know or want to measure or be aware of to start that conversation differently?
Yeah. I love that consumer approach because, um, you know, most people inside and outside of food safety and quality, they understand that we're making this for the consumer. And so when you are damaging your consumer reputation or your brand reputation, that seems to turn on a light bulb for them.
Mhm.
So I love taking that approach. I think one of the conversations that is also happening in the chat, and I like the way Austin formulated his
Mhm.
question, is that when compliance standards aren't actually improving safety, why do we
Mhm.
continue to employ them? And what I would say is, I mean, that's a really great question. And as we talk about even from a regulatory standpoint and our inspectors coming in, our auditors coming in, that's really a question for them and for us to help engage in those conversations and be a part of those conversations. I would say as leaders in food safety and quality, that is something that we should be having conversations with our regulators about regularly. And we should be having those conversations at the different conferences. We should be having those conversations at our third party or even GFSI. Like we know GFSI conference is happening this week, right? I wish I was there in Barcelona. I'm not calling in from Barcelona. I am in Baltimore. But is that a conversations that are happening there where we really talk about if being compliant is not decreasing the amount of illnesses that we see, that it's not decreasing the amount of recalls that we see, then why are we employing them? Why does that continue to be our bar even?
Mhm.
And then how do we support, or even from a regulatory standpoint, how do they support organizations building their food safety and quality culture over time? I think when you brought up the GFSI white paper, that's helping, right? Like that's helping kind of put together, this is what you should think about along the way to build your culture. But then, really, how are we holding organizations accountable? How are we continuing to have those conversations with industry? And that's what I love about what we do, right? Is that we really take a look at food safety culture, but we really work directly with our clients to build those things into their organization, whether it is, process control or leadership and strategy. Like
Mhm.
we help organizations build those into their actual process and integrate into their business, because that's really where the rubber meets the road, right? And we need to have those conversations with our government, and how they are looking at food safety.
We do, because just like you said, even that internal conversation, until regulatory shifts their perspective on that, which that will be like trying to turn an aircraft carrier or something. It's not going to happen overnight. But even as our food safety quality professionals in an organization, how do we make sure that even as we're looking at the different areas for improvement, knowing that if there's an area that compliance isn't moving the bar for us, like it's not directly helping us make a more food safe product, then what's the minimal effort we want to put on that so that we can shift our resources to other places?
Yeah.
So we do have, we too have to be actively in this conversation and looking at how compliance does help us in some areas, but it's not serving us well in others.
Right. Absolutely. And identifying where that is in your particular organization. right? Where are you working with continuous improvement and you're moving forward and things
Mhm.
don't need a lot of improvement, and where do you need a lot of improvement, and you need to have those conversations on what those big risks are. So that's something that we have to continue to be a part of. I see Felix comment around, change the leadership if they think compliance is enough. They're not qualified for FSQA leadership role. And when we think about building food safety and quality leaders, right? We want to make sure that we are having the conversations with people who are leading on the floor. That haven't moved into management yet, so that they could have a really good perspective on this is what it means to be compliant. This is what it means to have a world-class organization. And your role as a leader in food safety and quality is to get your organizations there. Now, we all know a lot of the times the pushback is not coming within food safety and quality. It's coming from other parts of the organization that don't want to approve a budget or don't understand why, or, sometimes the improvement is not going to actually come from our budget. It's going to come from an operating budget or operations budget or engineering budget or maintenance budget. And so we have to influence them to spend the money in food safety and quality. So they're asking the question on, but I haven't gotten any auditors bring up this part of our system. We haven't gotten any NRs for this. Why do you want to spend money here? Right? Like we hear that a lot from other people outside of food safety and quality.
Yeah. And, Tia, it reminds me because influence comes up all the time, whether it's in our LinkedIn Live or when we're working with different teams and people. So we need to put that on the list.
Yeah, we
when
do.
Tia comes back from maternity leave, we're going to talk about influence.
Yes.
We're going to talk about some of those top ways that we've seen, that we've been able to help influence to see and get feedback from others on those, because there's so many different avenues, and that always comes up. Influence always comes up on like, what does that look like and how do we do it? Right. So I think that should be a whole show in itself.
Yeah, I agree. We will have a lot to unpack there. And I know, even Landre, he had mentioned earlier that, a lot of the things that he does in his organization, at his facility, is because of his personality and connecting with people on the line. That's really about influence, right? Like he's really being able to connect with people and communicate with people in a way that's influencing the way that they're thinking about food safety and quality, and pushing them to think differently and to think past compliance. So I love that comment. And I love how it connects with influence. So definitely look out. That will definitely be a topic for us in the future.
Absolutely, because it just keeps popping up. So if we're not looking at that sign and seeing what's there, that people keep the conversation going around, we'd be amiss. So that's going to be coming up.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, compliance isn't, there's so many different areas to unpack around compliance. And so, even when you think about, Tia, because you've been with startups. I haven't been with startups from the ground up. I've been with small businesses, but not startups. Like, what are the things that you see that even as a startup you could do to kind of move into that next place to be ready for more than compliance?
Yes. The first step I would say is to look at your growth strategy and determine, and most startups have a growth strategy, a sales strategy. They're actually really good at saying, we want to be here by next year. We want to be in a Costco and a Target here. We want to create more products next year, or we're in Target. Target is now asking us for more product, and we have a plan to get there. Or we want our sales to be X amount by next year. So what I've seen is that startups, small businesses, they have that growth plan. What I would challenge them to do is to partner that with their food safety strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that they have either an internal person that can help build that strategy, or partner with an external partner where they're helping you build that food safety and strategy right along with their growth. Because the way that we look at the journey of food safety, the amount of exposure that you're getting, that's when you really need to start tackling certain risks. And that's how you kind of make the next step past compliance. So having the right partner to be able to say, okay, right now you're selling locally and you're touching, X amount of thousands of people. If you want to get into a Target or a Costco, now you're opening up your exposure. Maybe at first you are regional, so that exposure looks different. Okay, then let's develop a plan on the food safety side, and even the quality side, right? To reduce the risk. Now, in the next year or two, you want to be national. What are some plans that you need to put into place to make sure that you're reducing that risk, so that when your exposure gets larger, your risk doesn't significantly increase, because now you are reaching so many more people. So that's what I would say is the first step. And I would say it's the step that many startups are missing, that they forget about the food safety part and how that needs to improve as your exposure increases. They really are only thinking about compliance, and they're typically only talking to their food safety and quality people, whether internally or if they have an external consultant, they're only talking to them about certain programs. Oh, we need a HACCP plan. Oh, someone asked us for a supplier approval plan. We need help with that. Someone asked us for this. We need help with this. Oh, we want to do this certification. Help us with, it kind of jumps around versus saying, okay, what is our overall goal of the organization, and how do we partner that with food safety and quality?
Well, and since we've talked about this before, it is really interesting when we think about the gap between compliance and risk compared to perhaps growth in sales and exposure of an organization. That when they're small, since those things are smaller, sometimes compliance can fit into that bucket a little bit better, or it can, right? There isn't as much of a gap. But even for companies that are larger, the same thing happens, right? Where they all of a sudden are trying to double sales.
Right.
But have we gone back to look at capacity within our food safety team, not just from a compliance standpoint, but compliance is a part of that? Because if we're getting so much larger, is that team structured and able and set up to be able to handle that additional capacity that's coming through from a compliance standpoint and from additional risks?
Absolutely. We talk about this in leadership and development all the time, where what you're doing today is not enough to support what you want to do in the future, right? Like, you're successful now, but as you grow, as you go into different positions, as you become a better leader, you can't continue to lead the same way. You can't continue to do the same things that got you to this position, right? It's the same thing with food safety. You can't continue to live in this world of small business when now you are looking to be a medium-sized business or even a large business, or to double sales. You can't continue to do the same things because you're really not supporting the organization that you now are. And we run into that with a lot of our clients, where they grew faster than their food safety and quality program grew. And so now they're trying to catch up, where it's like, if you had invested, X amount of money a year to help your food safety and quality culture keep up with your growth, then it might have looked different than like, okay, now you have to invest so much more money just to get up to standard on where you are from an exposure standpoint and a risk standpoint.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important part, because as we see that growth, it's not just that there's additional risk, but that compliance, because we know, right, there are new parts coming out, there's new interpretations coming out, there's new guidelines always coming out. And so even being able to, if your goal is just to be compliance, you may even be at risk for just compliance if you don't have that longer term plan on what it looks like.
Absolutely. And that's honestly a really great point, because as things change in the world of compliance, we notice that organizations that have a world-class organization from a food safety standpoint, once compliance change, they really don't do anything different internally. They might update some wording to be compliant, right? To
Mhm.
satisfy auditors come in. They might change their documentation a little bit. Those things might change, but the way they get work done doesn't really change that much for the most part. Versus an organization that's only working at the compliance level, they start to scramble. And
Mhm.
it's like, oh no, now we have to do something completely different. And how are we going to roll it out? And, they don't have the processes in order to get things done in that way. And again, they're working at the bare minimum, that if anything changes, they're flustered. Take it back to the report card, right? If you're sitting at a D and then a new topic comes up and you're like, oh wow, I haven't studied this topic, this is completely new to me, you can immediately drop down to a failing grade. Versus if you're at an A and a new topic comes up and you're like, okay, I need to put a little bit more time into it. If I drop a little bit, I'll drop into the A minus B standpoint, but you're not failing at that
Mhm.
point. You have, again, room for improvement where your marking needs improvement to get you back up to that A. So it's a different mindset when you're like,
Mhm.
okay, I already have an A, a really high A. Now I just need to do some work to keep it, versus I'm at a D. I'm gonna drop down to an F if I don't get this together. Exactly, Missy. Compliance leaves no margin for error. Absolutely. You
Yeah.
start to scramble.
Yeah, it is, so I'm trying to think of all the things that we've kind of covered today. So like when it comes to compliance, right? We know compliance is kind of it's the low bar,
Hmm.
right? And it may be appropriate for some areas, but each organization needs to understand where that risk is for them and where they want to focus their time and energy.
Hmm.
Um, and see, we've talked about compliance. Is that the word that we want to put forth in conversations? Or is there a way to shift that conversation so it's more about risk?
Hmm.
What helps us shift the conversation for leadership?
Yeah. And that's great. And I think you brought up a really good example around just consumer data, where if someone's asking you about compliance, we can have, of course, we can have that conversation, but it's more around what type of risks do we want to take on as an organization? What type of organization does your company want to be? Do we want a risk of having a micro issue out in the marketplace? Do we
Mhm.
want to take on X risk because we have this area for improvement? Even though we're compliant, we still have this risk. Do we want to take that on? Pooling consumer complaints and having that conversation around, we have people complaining about this issue. Do we want to continue to have that risk out there? Or do we want to improve that and eliminate that complaint? Maybe you get an illness complaint, once a quarter. Is that what type of organization you want to be, where you're dealing with an illness complaint every 3 months?
Mhm.
Or and then how does that duplicate if you increase your sales? If you double your sales or triple your sales, is
Mhm.
that the type of organization you want to be? So having those conversations, trending consumer data, we also brought up too, like recalls and withdrawals and refusals that's happening out in the industry,
Mhm.
making sure that you bring those into the organization and not just have the conversation with your internal food safety and quality team, but spread it broadly throughout your organization. Spread it over into finance, over into maintenance, operations. Everyone should really know what's happening out in the industry and what could happen to your organization if you don't improve in certain areas, and be strategic about it, right? Like,
Mhm.
you don't want to talk about 10 different issues out there. Pick one or two top. I would even say one, issue, like maybe two, if you have the right KPIs where you are really sharing that information and saying, hey, we want to improve our sanitation program. These are the type of recalls, these are the type of complaints, these are the type of, you know, 483s or NRs that could come if we don't improve sanitation. And then sharing that across the organization, sharing that even on the floor, right? The people making the product, because they're really the ones that's going to be like, you know what, I don't feel right doing this without following up on what Jill sent me. And then their manager now has to make the decision to say no, we're not going to listen to her, or okay, yes, I understand, I also saw it, I understand your passion as someone that's actually making the food, let's move forward with it. And that's actually an influence technique.
Yeah, I think that's a big part. It's how do we make it relatable when we're having conversations? Because so often we speak in well, we're at a 90% conformance, or we're at 90% compliance. Or we'd all love to be Six Sigma compliance, but right, the reality is not there.
Right.
But how do we even translate that? So, if it's, wow, every 1 out of 10 packages going down the line, actually defective, whatever you want to call it, but how to help people go, whoa, I never thought of it that way. Like, I'm just making a pile. Like, every minute I have how many coming by that aren't going to be okay.
Right.
So that way more people can be part of that. Because when we go back to that core of like, right, as people, we always, we want to do something that has purpose, and what we do, we want it to matter. Yes. And so I haven't really run into anybody yet who says, you know what, when this stuff going down the line, like actually half of it gets rejected down there. They're like, what? How do we do this different? Exactly. What is it that we can do different? And I think making it relatable opens that conversation so that people then can have more pride in what we're doing, because we don't want to send crap down the line.
Right. Yeah.
We want to be proud and pass on the good things. And so I think that can be a really powerful perspective, even when we think about, maybe we can't scrub compliance term out of all of our language yet, but even from that standpoint can be a powerful tool that we can use.
Yeah. And you're talking about the money aspect, right? Like, this is how many product we throw away because we're having issues. Or, we clean for 2 hours, we take a swab, we fail, we have to clean again for another 2 hours. We do this, twice a month. We do it 50% of the time. Whatever it happens to be, it's like, how much time and therefore money could you save by having a robust sanitation program that's above and beyond compliance, where now our sanitation is 2 hours every single time because we know we're going to pass, because we have a great program. So, I mean, that's a huge thing. And actually that's like the number one influencer, right? Where you can say you can save money by doing this. You can get more run time by doing this. So if you can connect it there, that's the golden ticket.
It is. Yeah. And, I know with our audience, thank you all for being here, because I know we could talk about compliance in so many different aspects of this all day. Mm-hmm. And I do see that we are coming upon our hour. And, I'm really excited to share what we have coming up in April. Yes. So, keep the comments coming in, but we're really excited because in April, we are starting a 4-week series on onboarding and early technical leadership. So we actually have guests every week, and they're going to share insights, best practices, pitfalls, the things that they wish they would have known or wish somebody would have helped them with when they started in food, or even as they've journeyed through food. And so next week, our guest is the incredible Katrina Reed from General Mills. And Tia, I know you've personally even worked with her, so you've gotten to experience this firsthand with her.
I have. Yeah. I love Katrina. If she's listening in and if she's listened to our lives, there's a few examples that I've used that she's like, oh, I know that she's probably talking about me. Because Katrina, when I started in food, she was my first manager. So she's a great person to have as a part of our series. because onboarding is so important, and really early technical leadership is super important to build our food safety and quality leaders. So I'm excited to have her on for next week. I'm excited to listen to the lives that are happening through April. For those that do not know, I am having my first child in the next week or so. So you won't see me on all the April ones, but I will be listening. And if I get a chance to listen in real time, you'll see my hashtag real in my comments on the live. If not, then you will definitely see my hashtag replay, because these conversations are so valuable. Even the conversation that we had today around compliance, I know that I've taken a few points from the audience on, this is how they handle compliance. This is how they handle even working with their auditors, right? And how they manage how do I make my auditor happy versus helping my team move forward and away from just wanting compliance. So I learned so much during this time. And I'm looking forward to talking all about onboarding and early technical leadership, because it's so crucial as you look to build your food safety and quality culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, as always, we love to hear from you. So whether it's in the comments or connecting with us through our hello@foodsafetycatalyst.com email, T and I, we read every single one of them. So we love to connect that way as well. And I think that's what you'll hear me say this often, but that's what I love about our community is when we can kind of break down those walls and have real conversations, because that's where we actually get the learning that we can take back and apply. And so,
absolutely. And
so grateful for everybody here to do that, engage with us, participate with each other. That's the best.
Right. Absolutely. And then as we talked about, like really helping to influence, our government and how they look at compliance, we really do have to do that together. Right. Because we're better together. And that's really how you move a government agency, right, to think about things differently. We all have to come to the table and be a part of that change and add your perspective and talk to many different people. So we talk to people all the time about what they're doing in industry, and we'd love to hear it. We'd love to hear your comments. We'd love to get your feedback. So send us all, because we do read.
We do.
Read it.
And of course, we'll be back here next Wednesday at noon Eastern for more real talk, and Katrina will be with us.
All right.
So, thank you all
everyone,
for
have a
joining
great
us.
rest of your week. Thank you so much for the congratulations. Hopefully you'll see me next week, and I'm looking forward to the April series.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.
Bye.